Judge Alan Mitchell sat high on his perch in the courtroom, his gavel resting in his hand, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, impassive gaze. It had been a long day already, and he had a schedule to keep. The courtroom was filled with the usual array of cases: petty theft, traffic violations, and disorderly conduct. He had seen them all 1,000 times before, each one a predictable repeat of the last. As he called the next case, he barely looked up from the paperwork in front of him. Tamara Johnson stood at the defendant's table, her hands neatly folded in front of her. Despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, she held herself with the kind of quiet dignity that immediately caught the attention of those who knew what to look for, but not Judge Mitchell. He had his own set of biases and expectations, and to him she was just another woman in a long line of offenders. He barely gave her a second glance as he addressed her with a stern and authoritative tone. "Miss Johnson, you are charged with driving without a valid license. Do you have any explanation for this violation?" Tamara inhaled deeply and stood a little straighter, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, there has been a mistake. My license expired last month, but I had already applied for renewal. I was waiting for the new card to arrive in the mail, but due to some issues at the DMV, I didn't receive it in time." Judge Mitchell glanced down at his notes as if the answer had already been given to him. He had no time for explanations or excuses, and frankly, he wasn't interested. He had seen enough of these cases to know that people often came up with stories to avoid responsibility. He dismissed her words with a wave of his hand, and without looking up from the file in front of him, he issued his decision. "I've heard enough. The fine will be $300. Failure to maintain proper documentation is your responsibility. You'll pay the fine by the end of the week." Tamara's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She nodded respectfully and returned to her seat. She had grown used to this kind of treatment over the years, and though it hurt each time, she was resilient. She knew how the system worked, how people like her were often dismissed, and how justice often seemed like a distant ideal, a concept rather than a reality. She gripped her purse tightly and kept her gaze forward, not allowing herself to be distracted by the courtroom full of eyes that could sense her discomfort. As Judge Mitchell continued to work through the day's cases, he gave little thought to the woman in front of him. Tamara Johnson was just another name on a long list of defendants. To him, she was a minor case, a minor mistake made by someone who probably didn't deserve much more attention. But what he didn't know was that this was not just any woman before him. This was not the ordinary citizen whose case could be disposed of with a few words from the bench. This was someone who had dedicated her life to fighting for justice on a much larger scale than he could even begin to comprehend. But as the gavel came down, marking the end of another case, he had no idea that this routine moment would soon become one of the most significant turning points in his career, a small but important shift that would begin to unravel everything he thought he knew about the law, about fairness, about who deserved justice and who didn't. As Tamara walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the fine settled heavily on her shoulders, but she carried it with the same quiet grace that had become second nature over the years. The corridor outside the courtroom was filled with the sound of shuffled footsteps and murmurs, but to Tamara, it felt like a hollow echo in her mind. She had been through this before, too many times to count. The unspoken biases, the dismissive attitudes, the presumption of guilt simply because of the way she looked. Yet it still stung each time, especially because this time it wasn't just any routine mistake. She had tried to explain, to give a reasonable account, but in the eyes of Judge Mitchell, it hadn't mattered. She had been just another defendant, another person to be processed, a faceless name in the court's log. But Tamara wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just another black person in the system. She was far more than the assumptions people like Judge Mitchell made about her. The fine, while frustrating, was nothing compared to the battles she had fought to get to this point in her life. As she stepped into the elevator, she let out a breath, calming her thoughts. The day ahead was full of work that required her full attention. Tamara's life outside the courtroom was one of high stakes and responsibility. By day, she was an federal prosecutor, known for her meticulous work and razor-sharp legal mind. She had dedicated her career to handling some of the most complex and dangerous criminal cases in the country. For years, she had fought tirelessly to dismantle organized crime syndicates, corrupt corporations, and systemic injustices that plagued vulnerable communities. She had put away some of the most notorious criminals, including high-ranking cartel members, and had earned the respect of her colleagues for her ability to navigate cases with precision and integrity. Her journey to this point had been nothing short of extraordinary. Tamara had grown up in a tough neighborhood where opportunities were limited and the chances of escaping the cycle of poverty were slim. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat, Tamara learned early on the value of hard work and resilience. She was determined to make something of herself, not just for her own sake, but to prove that someone like her, someone from her background, could make it in a world that often didn't seem designed for people like her. Every challenge she faced, every obstacle thrown her way, only fueled her determination. She worked her way through law school, taking on part-time jobs to pay the bills, all the while keeping her eyes on the prize. Becoming a prosecutor was never just a career choice for her. It was a mission to bring justice to those who were too often ignored by the system. She knew the law was imperfect, but she also believed in its potential for good. That belief had driven her every day since she first donned the robes of a prosecutor. Yet despite her success and her contributions to the legal field, the moment in Judge Mitchell's courtroom reminded her of the harsh realities she still faced. No matter how high she climbed, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be seen first and foremost by some as the color of her skin. It was a truth that sat uncomfortably in her chest, a truth that she had learned to live with but had never fully accepted. As she left the courthouse and headed to her next case, Tamara's thoughts lingered on the interaction with Judge Mitchell. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same cold dismissal from the justice system. How many voices have been silenced simply because they didn't fit the mold of what the system expected? Asterisk, asterisk, and what would it take to change that? Asterisk, asterisk. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop fighting. Not for herself, and not for anyone who was unjustly overlooked by the very system meant to protect them. In that moment, as she walked through the busy streets, Tamara's resolve only strengthened. She would continue to rise, to fight, and to make a difference, no matter the challenges ahead. Judge Alan Mitchell sat back in his leather chair, the weight of years in the legal system pressing on his shoulders. His gavel rested beside him, worn from years of use. He was no stranger to the grind of the courtroom. Cases blended together in his mind, like a never-ending reel of film where each one followed the same predictable script. He prided himself on being efficient, making swift decisions, and running a tight courtroom. In his world, time was precious and justice was something you could measure in fines, rulings, and sentences. Yet, as much as he liked to think of himself as impartial, there were moments when his personal biases subtly shaped the way he saw the world. Judge Mitchell, nearing the end of his career, had grown disillusioned with what he viewed as the chaos of the modern legal system. He believed in law and order, in the idea that hard work and respect for authority would get you ahead in life. He had seen enough to form clear opinions about those who didn't follow these rules. People from certain backgrounds, particularly from lower income, Black or immigrant communities, seemed to him more prone to making mistakes and breaking the law. It wasn't something he ever consciously acknowledged. It wasn't blatant racism, but there was a pattern. He saw people like Tamara Johnson through the lens of his own narrow experiences, assuming that her situation, like so many others before her, was just a simple case of irresponsibility. In his mind, it didn't matter how well she dressed or how well-spoken she was. She was just another defendant trying to make excuses, trying to avoid the consequences of her actions. He'd been doing this job long enough to see it all: the elaborate stories, the excuses, the attempts to skirt responsibility. It was a system that, to him, operated on a clear and basic truth. If you broke the law, you paid the price. The details didn't matter, the background didn't matter, only the infraction mattered. So when Tamara stood before him in court, explaining the bureaucratic delay of the DMV, Judge Mitchell barely listened. Her words bounced off his mind like water off a stone. He'd heard it all before, people blaming the system, blaming others for their mistakes. There was no room in his world for exceptions. Justice, in his eyes, was black and white. Tamara's calm and collected demeanor only served to further solidify his perception of her as someone who was trying to avoid responsibility. It wasn't the first time he'd imposed a fine on someone who looked like Tamara. People like her had a tendency to show up in his courtroom. They were the ones who seemed to think that the rules didn't apply to them. And so he handed down his decision, the fine a cold, bureaucratic solution to a problem he felt was far too common. His mind was already moving on to the next case before her name was even fully out of his mouth. Yet deep down, there was something about this particular case that lingered with him, a fleeting thought, a small voice in his mind that kept telling him there was more to Tamara Johnson than met the eye. But it was a voice he quickly silenced. He had a reputation to uphold, a career that had been built on making decisions swiftly and efficiently. There was no room for doubt, no room for second-guessing. He was the judge, and his word was final. But as he dismissed her and moved on to the next case, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just sentenced someone who wasn't who he thought she was. A week later, Judge Alan Mitchell found himself at a legal conference on criminal justice reform, a subject he'd always felt was more about politics than real change. The conference was full of familiar faces, colleagues from various levels of the legal system, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and even a few judges who shared his pragmatic, no-nonsense approach. As usual, Mitchell was there to gather insights that might help him handle his own caseload more efficiently, but he wasn't particularly invested in the discussions about racial bias or the reform of sentencing practices. To him, these issues were often overblown by people who had little experience in the trenches of real courtrooms. He was seated in a lecture hall, waiting for the next speaker, when the moderator stepped up to the podium and introduced the next panelist. The name made his stomach tighten in an unexpected way. Tamara Johnson, For a brief moment, Judge Mitchell thought he might have misheard. He couldn't imagine that the woman from his courtroom, the one he had fined so quickly, would be speaking at a conference of this caliber. But there she was, standing confidently at the front of the room, her poised demeanor now the focal point of the audience's attention. As she began to speak, something strange happened. The words that came out of Tamara's mouth weren't just those of a prosecutor. They were the words of someone deeply invested in changing the very system he thought he understood so well. She spoke about racial disparities in the criminal justice system, about the challenges of being a black professional in a predominantly white field, and about the often overlooked human costs of judicial decisions. The way she articulated her thoughts, the clarity and passion in her voice, held the room in rapt attention. She wasn't just presenting facts, she was speaking from experience, from a place of genuine understanding that Mitchell couldn't ignore. Judge Mitchell's eyes narrowed as he listened to her. Her words were sharp, but there was an underlying empathy in her voice that he hadn't expected. Tamara was not the stereotypical defendant he had pegged her as, not the faceless offender who had tried to make excuses in his courtroom. She was a force in her own right, someone who had built a career in a system that had often worked against people like her. She spoke about the systemic issues, about the struggles people of color faced when interacting with the justice system, and the need for reform that would not just look good on paper, but actually create meaningful change. As the panel continued, Judge Mitchell found himself unable to look away. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something unsettlingly captivating about her. She was eloquent, informed, and poised, everything he had not expected in the woman he had dismissed so easily. The fine he had imposed on her now seemed, in hindsight, rash and uninformed. His judgment, once seen as swift and efficient, now felt like a mistake. But it was too late for him to take back the ruling. He sat quietly, absorbing her words, a part of him unwilling to acknowledge just how much her speech was making him rethink everything he had believed about fairness and the law. When the panel concluded, Judge Mitchell lingered in his seat, his mind spinning. He had not expected to be moved by a simple conference speech, but he had been. As the audience began to filter out, he caught sight of Tamara in the hallway, deep in conversation with another colleague. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same woman he had found in his courtroom only days earlier, but now, seeing her in a new light, he realized just how little he truly knew about her and about the biases that had shaped his judgment. He hesitated for a moment, then approached her, unsure of what to say. Tamara noticed him almost immediately. Their eyes locked for a second, and the weight of their previous interaction seemed to hang in the air between them. This time, however, it was different. There was no gavel to fall, no final decision to make. There was only a moment of realization. As Judge Mitchell approached Tamara, his heart beat a little faster than usual. He hadn't planned this, hadn't expected to feel compelled to speak to her after the conference. But there was something about her presence, something about the way she had so confidently dismantled the assumptions he held about the justice system, that made him uneasy. He had spent decades ruling from the bench, believing in his experience and his ability to remain objective. But now, after hearing her speak, he realized just how much he had missed, how much he had misunderstood. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice surprisingly unsure. I wanted to thank you for your speech today. It was powerful, insightful." Tamara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She was used to people complimenting her work, but she wasn't sure what to make of this particular judge's words. She knew who he was, of course. Judge Mitchell had a reputation in the courthouse for being tough, but efficient. His courtroom was like clockwork, ruthless at times, but predictable. Now seeing him standing before her, looking somewhat out of place in the casual setting of the hallway, she could sense the discomfort in his stance. Something had shifted in him, though she wasn't sure what. "Thank you, Judge Mitchell," she replied, her tone cool but not unfriendly. "I appreciate that." There was an awkward pause between them, and for a moment, neither knew quite what to say. Tamara was careful, aware of the power dynamics at play. A judge, especially one like Mitchell, wasn't someone you casually conversed with. Yet as the silence lingered, something in her shifted too. Her frustration from their earlier encounter started to resurface, but now there was curiosity, mixed with a sense of justice. There was no ignoring the fact that the man before her had once been the one to impose that fine on her. He hadn't listened to her explanation. He had dismissed her with a wave of his hand, assuming her words were just more excuses. But something had clearly changed. "I didn't expect to see you here," Judge Mitchell continued, his voice still unsure. I thought you were just another defendant, someone trying to avoid responsibility." Tamara's brow furrowed, the subtle shift in his demeanor catching her off guard. He had just admitted something significant, something he had never acknowledged in the courtroom. He had seen her as a faceless defendant, just another person who had made a mistake. He had imposed the fine without really considering who she was or the bigger picture. She took a slow breath, her posture stiffening slightly. "I understand," she said, her voice steady but firm. "It's easy to make assumptions, Judge, but sometimes the system doesn't give us a chance to explain our side. It doesn't always see the bigger picture." Judge Mitchell's eyes widened. She wasn't angry, as he might have expected, but there was a quiet disappointment in her words that struck him harder than any harsh rebuke could. He could see that she wasn't out for revenge, but he knew this wasn't a simple matter of a fine and an apology. She was right. The system often didn't see the bigger picture. And now he realized neither had he. "I made a mistake," he confessed, his voice quieter this time. "In the courtroom, I didn't take the time to listen. I didn't see you as anything more than another case. And for that, I'm sorry." Tamara's eyes softened. She had expected a defensive reaction, perhaps even anger, but the sincerity in his voice caught her by surprise. She had no illusions about the power he held in the system, but hearing him acknowledge his mistake felt like a step towards something more meaningful. "It's not just about you and me, Judge," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about how many people slip through the cracks, how many get punished for things that aren't even their fault. The system doesn't listen to everyone equally, and it's not just about what happens in the courtroom. It's about what happens outside of it, too." For the first time in the conversation, Judge Mitchell felt the weight of those words sink in. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Tamara. It was about a larger issue, one that had been building beneath the surface for years. The biases, the assumptions, the blind spots, they were all part of a system that needed reform. As they stood there, a quiet understanding passed between them. Tamara wasn't looking for an apology, not really. But the fact that Mitchell was willing to admit his mistake, to reflect on his own actions, gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the system could change. Maybe, just maybe, people could learn. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice softer now. "That's all I ever really wanted." And for the first time, Judge Mitchell understood that sometimes it wasn't just the law that needed to be corrected, it was the people enforcing it. The days following that encounter with Tamara Johnson left Judge Alan Mitchell restless. His world, once so clear-cut and predictable, had become murky. It wasn't just the conversation with her that unsettled him. It was everything she had forced him to confront. He had lived his life believing that justice was something you could impose with a firm hand, that the law was something you could measure, quantify, and enforce without getting too bogged down in emotions or personal biases. But now, with each passing hour, he found himself questioning that certainty. Mitchell had never been one to second-guess himself. He had built his career on swift decisions and firm rulings. But ever since the conference, he couldn't shake the thought of how quickly he had dismissed Tamara in his courtroom, how easily he had seen her as just another person in a long line of offenders. The assumptions he had made about her, the casual dismissal of her situation, he couldn't stop replaying it in his mind. What had made him think that her story, her explanation, wasn't worth hearing? Was it the fact that she was a black woman? Was it because, in his mind, people like her were just more prone to making excuses? The question haunted him. He had always prided himself on being fair, but now he wondered, was he really? Had he, too, fallen into the trap of systemic bias that he had spent so many years of his career ignoring? It wasn't just guilt eating at him. It was the realization that he had been complicit in a system that had allowed such biases to thrive. He had been so absorbed in his efficiency, in his desire to move cases quickly, that he hadn't stopped to truly see the people standing before him. He hadn't taken the time to consider their humanity, their circumstances, or the full scope of their stories. The more he thought about it, the more he began to feel like he had failed. Not just Tamara, but everyone who had ever stood in his courtroom and been judged without truly being heard. How many times had he been too quick to pass judgment, too quick to impose fines, sentences, or penalties without understanding the whole picture? He realized he had been living in a bubble of privilege, one that protected him from seeing the world from other people's perspectives. Mitchell knew he needed to make things right. But how? The justice system was vast, complex, and institutionalized. Could one person, could he, really make a difference? It seemed daunting. But after spending so many years in the system, he had also seen how small changes could ripple out and create larger shifts. Maybe, just maybe, he could start with his own actions. He began to dig into the work that Tamara had spoken about at the conference, the research on racial disparities in sentencing, the challenges people of color faced in the legal system. He spent his nights reading case studies, listening to lectures, and reaching out to colleagues who were experts in these areas. The more he learned, the more he saw how blind he had been to the structural issues within the system. The more he realized that justice as he had always defined it, wasn't as simple as following rules and handing out sentences. It was about fairness, empathy, and understanding. Judge Mitchell also began reaching out to Tamara. After their conversation, he had promised to listen more, and he intended to follow through. They began meeting for coffee occasionally, discussing the issues that mattered most to her. She was hesitant at first, unsure of his sincerity, but as they spoke, she saw the change in him. He wasn't just asking questions for the sake of appearing politically correct. He genuinely seemed to care about understanding the truth of what people like her, people like the defendants who came before him, experienced every day. For Tamara, it was both encouraging and surreal. The same man who had once so easily dismissed her was now listening to her, seeking her counsel. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but Tamara began to see the beginnings of a shift, a slow but meaningful transformation in someone who had once been part of the very system that had failed her. One day, as they sat together in a quiet cafe, Tamara said something that struck Mitchell deeply. "I don't expect you to be perfect, Judge. No one is. But just being willing to listen, to acknowledge that the system has its flaws, that's where change begins." Those words lingered with him long after their conversation ended. He didn't have all the answers, and he couldn't single-handedly change the entire system. But he could start by being more conscious of his decisions, by questioning his own biases, by making sure the people who came before him in court were truly seen, not just as cases, but as human beings with complex lives and stories. It wasn't enough to simply make rulings. He had to make decisions based on understanding, fairness, and empathy. And as he sat in his office late one evening, contemplating the road ahead, Judge Mitchell realized that this was only the beginning. He had a long way to go, but now, for the first time in his career, he was ready to truly listen. Judge Alan Mitchell had always prided himself on his ability to make quick decisions, his unwavering confidence in his role as a judge. He had navigated complex legal matters for years, issuing rulings with the authority of someone who had never doubted the fairness of the system. But now, the very foundation of his approach was being tested in ways he had never anticipated. Every decision he made, no matter how small, felt like a crossroads, an opportunity to either fall back into old habits or embrace the changes he had started to recognize within himself. One afternoon, a case came before him that would force him to confront his transformation head-on. The defendant was a young man named Marcus Turner, a 22-year-old with a history of minor offenses, most of which were related to poverty and a lack of opportunity. Marcus had been caught in possession of a small amount of marijuana, but his case was complicated by the fact that he had been arrested while attempting to leave an area known for gang activity. The police had pulled him over for a routine stop, but there were conflicting accounts of whether the arrest was justified. It was a classic case of racial profiling, one that Judge Mitchell had seen many times before. In the past, Mitchell might have seen Marcus as just another criminal, a young man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, making poor decisions. He might have handed down a sentence quickly, perhaps a fine or a brief stint in jail, without truly considering the underlying factors at play. But now, with the lessons he had learned from his interactions with Tamara, he found himself questioning the usual assumptions. As he read through the case file, he remembered what Tamara had said to him during one of their coffee meetings. Asterisk, the system doesn't always account for the circumstances that led to someone's actions. It's easy to forget that people are shaped by their environments, by their experiences. Asterisk. Those words echoed in his mind as he looked at Marcus's file. The young man had grown up in a neighborhood riddled with violence, poverty, and a lack of resources. He had been raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. In the eyes of the law, Marcus might be viewed as another statistic, a young man from a troubled background with a history of poor decisions. But Mitchell now understood that the story didn't end there. During the trial, Marcus's defense attorney argued that his client had never been part of a gang and was simply trying to escape a dangerous situation when he was arrested. The evidence for his innocence was weak, but the circumstances around his arrest were clear. He was in a bad area, but he wasn't necessarily a bad person. There was a chance that, given the right environment, Marcus could turn his life around. But would the system allow for that? As the trial wore on, Mitchell found himself debating internally. He thought about how often people like Marcus were treated as disposable, as if their past mistakes defined them completely. The idea of handing down another sentence to someone who had already been failed by society didn't sit well with him. He remembered his own experiences, how he had judged people based on their appearance, their background, or their socioeconomic status, and he felt a pang of guilt. When it came time for Mitchell to deliver his verdict, the courtroom was silent, every person waiting for his decision. It was an ordinary case on the surface, but to Mitchell, it felt monumental. The old Judge Mitchell, the one who had made swift, often harsh decisions, would have made a ruling based purely on the law, perhaps a minor sentence or a fine. But this time, he couldn't do that. The law alone wasn't enough. He needed to think about Marcus as a person, not just a defendant. I've considered the facts of this case carefully, Mitchell began, his voice steady but serious. While the law must hold individuals accountable for their actions, it must also recognize that the circumstances in which people find themselves cannot be ignored. Mr. Turner is not just a product of his mistakes. He is a product of his environment. This court will not add to the cycle of punishment that has already shaped his life. The room was still, as if everyone were holding their breath. Marcus's defense attorney exchanged surprised glances with his client. Even the prosecutor, who had expected a standard ruling, seemed caught off guard by the judge's tone. Mitchell continued, "Instead of a punitive sentence, I am ordering that Marcus Turner be enrolled in a rehabilitation program. He will undergo counseling, community service, and vocational training aimed at providing him with the tools to make better choices and rebuild his future." This court believes in second chances. As the gavel came down, Mitchell knew he had made the right decision, but a part of him was still uncertain. Was he just making excuses for Marcus? Was this really justice, or was it an attempt to fix what he now saw as a broken system? Yet, as he looked at the young man in front of him, he realized that sometimes justice wasn't about being harsh. It was about being fair. It was about understanding the full story, not just the isolated incident. Later, when he walked out of the courtroom, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. The decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. He had given Marcus a chance to change, and in doing so, he had given himself the opportunity to truly live by the principles he had once only preached. The path to reform was long, but this was a start. And for the first time in years, Judge Mitchell felt like he was doing the right thing, not just by the law, but by the people it was meant to serve. As the weeks passed after his decision in Marcus Turner's case, Judge Alan Mitchell found himself reflecting more and more on the choices he had made, both in and out of the courtroom. It was becoming clear to him that his shift in perspective was not just a temporary change, but the beginning of a deeper, lasting transformation. He could no longer see the world through the narrow lens of the law alone. The law was important, yes, but it was also a tool, and tools could be misused, warped, or misunderstood. The real challenge was understanding the people who stood before him, not just their crimes, but their lives, the complexities of their struggles, and the unseen factors that led them down certain paths. One afternoon, while sitting in his chambers, Judge Mitchell received a letter. It was from Tamara Johnson, the prosecutor he had met months earlier. He had not seen her since that day of the conference, but he had continued to reach out to her for advice and guidance. Their relationship had become one based on mutual respect and an understanding that both of them, in their own ways, were trying to make the justice system work for everyone, not just a select few. The letter was brief, but the words inside were powerful. Asterisk Judge Mitchell asterisk. Asterisk, I wanted to reach out and thank you again for your openness and your willingness to listen. Your recent ruling in the Marcus Turner case was a reminder that change is possible, even within a system that so often feels rigid and unyielding. I believe you are on the right path, and I'm excited to see how you will continue to evolve as a judge. The system needs more people like you, asterisk. Asterisk, I know it's not easy, but you're doing something incredibly important. Keep pushing forward. And thank you again for taking the time to truly see people for who they are, not just for what they've done, asterisk. Asterisk warmly, asterisk. Asterisk Tamara Johnson, asterisk. Judge Mitchell read the letter several times, each time feeling a little more gratitude and a little more resolve. It was rare for him to receive such praise, especially from someone who knew the inner workings of the justice system so intimately. Tamara's words gave him a sense of validation, a reminder that his new approach wasn't just idealistic. It had the potential to truly make a difference. He thought back to the case with Marcus Turner. The young man had come to his courtroom, nervous, uncertain, perhaps expecting the same harsh treatment he had always encountered. But instead, Judge Mitchell had treated him like a human being, acknowledging the forces that had shaped his life. In the months since, he had received reports from the rehabilitation program Marcus was enrolled in. Marcus was making progress. He had a job now, something that felt like a monumental step for a young man who had once been on the brink of losing everything. It wasn't just Marcus that was changing, it was Judge Mitchell too. He had started to approach each case with a new mindset. Instead of seeing people as faceless defendants, he now tried to see them as individuals with stories that were often far more complex than the charges they faced. Some of his colleagues noticed the change in him, though they didn't quite understand it. They were still focused on efficiency, on getting through cases quickly, without stopping to ask the hard questions. Mitchell had begun to challenge their assumptions, pushing them to think more critically about the human side of the law. One afternoon, during a particularly contentious trial, Mitchell found himself once again facing a difficult decision. The defendant, a middle-aged man named James Holloway, was up for sentencing on charges of assault. He had a long criminal record, and the evidence against him seemed solid. His defense attorney argued for leniency, citing Holloway's difficult upbringing and the fact that he had been trying to get his life together after serving time for a previous offense. As Mitchell listened to the arguments, he couldn't help but think of Marcus and the lessons he had learned. James Holloway wasn't just a criminal. He was a person who had struggled in ways Mitchell couldn't fully understand, but he could try to empathize with. Instead of imposing a standard sentence, Mitchell ordered that Holloway undergo a long-term rehabilitation program, similar to the one Marcus had participated in. It was a bold decision, and one that would likely raise eyebrows among his peers, but Mitchell felt it was the right thing to do. Just as he had given Marcus a chance, he had to give James a chance as well. The law wasn't just about punishment, it was about finding ways to help people rebuild their lives. As the weeks turned into months, Mitchell's reputation began to shift. People started to see him not just as a judge who followed the letter of the law, but as someone who cared about the people whose lives were shaped by it. His rulings became known for their empathy and their willingness to look beyond the surface to consider the broader circumstances that led people to his courtroom. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that reforming the justice system would take much more than just changing his own approach. But he had made a start. He had learned to listen, to understand, and to make decisions that weren't just about applying the law, but about applying justice in its truest sense. And as he sat back in his office, reading Tamara's letter one last time, Judge Mitchell realized that he had finally found his own path forward, a path not just of rulings, but of real change.